Georgi Tsveteli Institute, am I pronouncing it correctly, of Oriental Studies, Ilia State University in Tbilisi. His research interest includes the difficulties and challenges the ethnic and religious minorities are facing in Muslim majority countries in the Middle East. Arzu Yilmaz is a visiting scholar at the University of Hamburg. She moved to Berlin in 2018 as Istanbul Policy Center Mercator Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. She spent 7 years in the Kurdistan region of Iraq as a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the University of the Hook and as the chair of the Department of International Relations at the American University of Kurdistan. Arzu obtained her PhD in International Relations from Ankara University in Turkey. Yay, me too. Not PhD, but I have BA and MA.
Yeah, yes,
and
bachelor.
That's great. So you're from Mülkiye. You had the Mülkiye stamp. And she wrote her dissertation, PhD dissertation on Kurdish refugees in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Finally, Ohannes Kılıçdağı researches the history of non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey, intercommunal relations in multi-ethno-religious societies, citizenship and minorities, the history of citizenship and military service, and historical sociology and the philosophy of history. He was Kazan visiting professor in Armenian studies at California State University in autumn 2020. In spring, he was appointed as Nikit and Eleonora Ordianian visiting professor in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University. Congratulations on that. It's been recently. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your presentations. As we said, our organizer Nadine is very strict, so we are going to keep the presentations to 7 minutes so that we have enough time for Q&A afterwards. We will start with Güneş, and then we'll move on to Majid, then Arzu, and then we'll complete the presentations with Ohannes's talk. And I will go on mute now. Please, everyone, also mute yourselves if you're not speaking. And Güneş, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thanks much, Zeynep. And maybe just to give very brief background information about this project. Zeynep and I were in Iraqi Kurdistan. It has been 3 years, back in 2018. We were doing some field work in the camps, mostly populated by the Yezidis. And then all this idea actually came from this field work in that part of the world 3 years ago. And then Zeynep has been really a core member of this project from the beginning. In 2019, almost like 2 years ago, in March 2019, there was a conference at the University of Central Florida. Many of the contributors to this book attended. And then the book actually came out of that conference. And then after 2 years, we are very glad to see it's actually printed. Again, I would like to thank Zeynep and all the colleagues at LSE's Middle East Center for hosting this. There has been a huge increase in the interest among the scholars, and not to mention about the public, about the fate of the Yezidis. So in this sense, like, what I try to do in this book is, as an editor, is try to put the Kurdish and Yezidi studies in a greater communication. Because again, there has been lots of discussions about the identity of the Kurds, identity of the Yezidis, and when it comes to the Yezidis, there's always this question of whether they are Kurds or not. And I have to say that it's a highly complicated question depending on what Yezidis you are talking to, and that is, I think, very clear in the pages of this book. And the way in which I kind of frame it is that it promises to provide a systematic understanding of how the Kurds and Yezidis interact with each other, the formation of both the Kurdish and Yezidi identities, and maybe more than that, also how the Kurds and Yezidis interact with the other people in the region. Because most of the Kurdish studies so far, obviously, I think for the right reasons, focus on their interaction with the states, the dominating, hegemonic, repressive states. This has been maybe one of the core, like the direction of the literature in Kurdish studies. But then when it comes to how the Kurds interact with the other minorities, there has been more kind of a gap in the scholarship. And I mean, at least some of the contributions to this book try to kind of address this interaction. I mean, in the sense that how the, for example, Kurds interacted with Armenians. This is basically the study of the Ohannes in his chapter. Or obviously how the Yezidis interact with the Kurds. This has been the topic of a couple of chapters in this book. So this is basically how I think about maybe one of the main contributions of this book. The other thing I should emphasize that the book, I think, relies on 5 or 6 different languages in terms of original data collection. I mean, obviously, we have people who are speaking Arabic, like Majid, for example. We have scholars who speak Ohannes. We have a couple of speakers who basically use Kurdish and Turkish sources, and obviously some of the Western languages. So like the chapters really kind of try to capitalize on different kind of original sources to basically promote like different original understanding of these interactions. The other thing is that the book, I mean, I'm a political scientist, but many of the people in this book who contribute to it are not political scientists. So we try to have a more interdisciplinary approach, which basically utilize insights from sociology, from history, from cultural studies, and from anthropology. So I think that is basically one of the other important goals of the book. So since I have limited time, I just want to maybe going over some of the issues superficially, but I also want to be respectful of the other the speaker's time. So one thing I should say that there's a tendency especially in both Kurdish and Yezidi studies, in the sense that, and if I can paraphrase Milan Kundera, who is obviously a very important French and Czech novelist, I mean, in a sense, in both cases, there's this kind of a struggle of memory against forgetting in both Kurdish and Yezidi studies. And maybe in Kurdish studies, this has been overcome because I think there's a kind of a clear understanding of, from the vantage point of the Kurds, how the history is now basically perceived, maybe unlike 20, 30 years ago. And when it comes to Yezidi studies, we are only seeing the beginning of that kind of vantage point, in the sense that there's only a new focus on how the Yezidis make sense of their history and how they basically perceive what happened to them in the early modern and modern ages, and also in the contemporary ages. So I think that is just very important, but at the same time, in a sense, it may take us to this realm of the notion of victimhood, in the sense that, I mean, it's just obviously true that both Kurdish and Yezidi people are subject to high levels of repression, high levels of violence, and then it obviously kind of fosters this image of like the victims. I mean, we kind of acknowledge that in this book, but at the same time, as scholars, it's also our responsibility to kind of really try to recognize the agency of both the Kurds and the Yezidis. And I just want to emphasize that because, especially when it comes to inter-communal relations, how the Yezidis interact with the Kurds, or how the Kurds interact with the Armenians, or how the Kurds interact with the hegemonic Turkish ethnicity in Turkey, all this notion of the agency becomes very important. And I think one of the contributions of this book, in the sense that we really kind of try to like develop this perspective through which the agency of the ethnic groups and their leaders became much more clear. And this basically, I think, helps us to maybe go beyond this notion of victimhood, which typically assigns a kind of passive, like a perspective to the like the dominated ethnic groups. And maybe since I'm running out of time, maybe I can say something about the Yezidis, because this is my also contribution to this this book. I mean, obviously, when you think about what happened in 2014, the genocidal attacks by the IS, I mean, this is basically kind of really the event which defines the Yezidi victimhood. But at the same time, what we try to do is that we try to kind of talk to victims, we try to basically make sense of their perspectives, and we try to basically see how the identities, even after genocidal attacks, can be highly complicated, highly fragmented, and then maybe under what conditions we can talk about the rise of more empowerment and a sense of political agency. And maybe just to kind of conclude, is that, at least for me, one of the most paradoxical consequences of the genocidal attacks of 2014 is that maybe for the first time in history, we can talk about Yezidi politics of recognition, because this was the first time when the Yezidis really became more like actors in a global stage where they basically receive recognition. And I mean, obviously, you don't want to have a genocide to be able to reach that stage. But maybe if I want to say something more optimistic from this perspective, this is basically kind of like the time when people really try to make sense of the Yezidis and also accept them as they are. And maybe in this sense, I can basically finish there with a more optimistic tone and let Majid maybe give a more in-depth understanding of the Yezidi experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Güneş. That was great. And thanks for keeping to time. Majid, over to you. You're on mute. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now
Okay.
I can.
Mm-hmm. So I send my presentation by email. I don't know if it reach you, or should I share share screen?
I thought you were going to share it. Do you?
Yeah, okay, but sometimes doesn't work. Let me try again.
Okay. Nadine, do you have the presentation at the ready?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Nadine. I'll go mute over to you, Majid. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the editor of this project, Dr. Güneş Murat Tezcür. And also I would like to thank the organizer of this event, Dr. Zeynep. So I think this is a 2 or 3 times we meet before also by Skype. And it's a honor for me to be asked to collaborate on this important book. And it is my pleasure to participate in this event. Perhaps some of you already know how Yezidi research is, but maybe not. When I started my PhD almost 10 years ago, I went into the university library and looked up the term Yezidi just to see how it defines us. I saw a huge, brand new, beautiful 20 volume of Encyclopedia of Religion. I went to the end of the line of the book and took out the last volume. I opened it at the letter Y, and I searched for the word Yezidi. What was written there? Nothing. I thought, how can this be? It was actually a strange feeling to know that we, in the eyes of the Encyclopedia of Religion, I simply did not exist. Western and even Iraqi newspaper have really only begun to report on the Yazidi since 2014. In a sense, nationally and internationally, the Yazidi have remained invisible all this time. At the moment, Yazidi identity is shifting. Today, I hope to give you a little insight into the historical and political dimension of this. My chapter examined the historical and political dimension of Yazidi identity before and after the Firman or genocide of 3 August 2014. It includes the following: introduction, the Yazidi as an ethno-religious group. How can I go to the second page? The state of Iraq and the Yazidis, political dimension of Yazidi identity in Iraq, the Iraqi Arab nationalist and political parties, the Kurdish nationalist and political parties, the Yazidi political movements in Iraq, the transmission of Yazidi identity in the Caucasus, manifestation of the transmission of Yazidi identity after 2014, and conclusion. What is the study about? My chapter examined the Yazidi identity before and after the ISIS attack on Yazidi, which took place on the 3rd of August 2014. It pays special attention to the historical and political evolution of Yazidi identity. But first, let me give you some background on the Yazidi. Iraq is the country of origin of the Yazidi. The Temple of Lalish, the most sacred place of the Yazidi faith, is located in Iraq. It is important to the Yazidi people is similar to the of the Vatican for Catholics. Yazidi identity has been in flux for some time. Political development in Iraq since the 1960s have resulted in major transmissions to Yazidi identity. The early Second Republican era in 1963 the US invasion of Iraq 2003 and the ISIS attack on the Yezidi in 2014 are significant here. In the recent past, Yezidi's identity become an issue in very different contexts. For example, the transnational nature of the Yezidi become an identity issue in the former Soviet Union during the 1920s. But in Iraq, in the 1960s, both Kurdish and Arab nationalists tried to co-opt Yezidi into their agendas by claiming that their ethnicity was Kurdish or Arab. Nevertheless, no independent Yezidi ethno-nationalist position on the matter of Yezidi identity exists period to 2003. So after the US invasion in Iraq in 2003, new Yazidi political movement formed political relation with non-Yazidi parties. However, this did not help to resolve the identity question. Kurdish activists and members of the Kurdish political party, especially the Kurdistan Democratic Party and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan PUK, believe that the Yezidi are Kurdish and still do so. But in August 2014, ISIS invaded Sinjar and the Nineveh plain. The Iraqi army and the Peshmerga forces failed to protect them from ISIS. So the Yezidi lost faith in politics and in the military. This has had a huge impact on the Yazidi public opinion. As these examples show, Yazidi identity is fragile and in fact, it was almost destroyed. Now it is being rebuilt more or less from the ground up. Perhaps for the first time in history, the Yazidi identity is becoming recognized as an ethno-religious identity of its own, at least in academic circles, which I dealt with this case in different research in past. Let us now look at the research questions. First question: why did the attitude of the Yezidi minority change in 1960s, particularly their attitude toward Arabs and Kurdish? So, there's some details in my paper how the Yezidi attitude towards nationalist parties in monarchical period and in the Republican period. The second question is how has Yazidi identity in Iraq, Syria, and Soviet Union been affected by political developments in these countries? The other question is how have political and policy changes before and after 2014 affected to the Yazidi as a religious minorities? The last question is how have the Yazidi participate in political life to date? So I follow the methodology of this study. I use this official document, historical sources, and personal interviews with public representative, along with internet survey in English, Russian, and Arabic. So the result of the study, I bring some point here. One of it, after 2014 attack, Yezidi called for the ISIS attack on them to be recognized as a genocide based on religion. The ISIS attacked and the withdrawal of Kurdish armed forces from the Sinjar region, which left the Yazidi in the hand of ISIS, caused a significant change in the political identity of the Yazidi in Iraq and abroad. The other point, the attack and its aftermath have redefined Yazidi relation with their Muslim neighbors. The relation between the Yazidi and the Sunni Arabs and Sunni Kurdish has broken down. These events and development have a significant impact on the entire Yazidi community worldwide. they are now rethinking the religion, ethnic, and national aspect of their identity. So the last point here, the Yezidi differ from region to region and from country to country, from Rojava in Syria to Bashiqa and Bazane in the disputed areas in Iraq, where Arabs speaking Yazidi life, to Sinjar and Sheikhan in which is belong to Kurdish region. There are also diaspora in Russia, Armenia, and Georgia. Given this diversity, there has never been political unity among the Yezidis. At the same time, the absence of the Yezidi in international media coverage and in political and academic debate focusing on region and the event in which they live is surprising. The discrimination and suffering endured by other minorities in Iraq has been researched and reported to some extent. For example, but not on the Yezidi, this is slowly beginning to change. Because of their religion, Yezidi spend their lives confronted by challenges, which is affected on their identity, inclusion and exclusion, discrimination and marginalization, all heighten the Yazidis' need for a separate identity. On the other hand, victims of discrimination can easily become discriminatory themselves and reproduce the discourse of religion hatred. To date, none of political parties in Iraq have been able to unite the Yazidi under one political banner. So I can go to the end. The outcome of this chapter shows that the nationalist and political parties in Iraq must accept the Yazidi the way they are. Attempts to change them and to impose unfamiliar ideologies on the Yazidi most firmly remain, I think, of the past. Yazidis, on the other hand, must understand that confrontation with other ethno-national or political groups will not lead to peace. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Majid. That was
finished in the time.
Okay. Sort of, but Arzu said her talk is going to be 5 minutes, so I gave her 2-3 minutes to you. So it will be out at the end. Over to you, Arzu.
I hope I can keep my promise.
Well, you promised. I don't know.
Let's see.
Thank you.
So shall I start? Yes, my paper focuses on the political identity of the Kurdish refugees who fled to Iraqi Kurdistan in 1994 during the civil war in Turkey and who have been settled in Mahmur camp and 5 other settlements around the cities Erbil and Duhok. To start with, I would like to underline that the Kurdish refugees settled in those locations are known and locally called PKK people because of their affiliation with the PKK since the early days of their refuge to Iraqi Kurdistan. Generally speaking, it is true that the vast majority of those Kurdish refugees are PKK sympathizers, and even many of them are the families of the fighters in the PKK. However, given the root causes of their migration and their actual and legal status in Iraqi Kurdistan, it is also true that they are refugees who faced with persecution, oppression, and forced to migrate to another country. So in this regard, the Kurdish refugees I focused on represents a sample of refugee warriors community, which is conventionally defined not merely as a passive group of dependent refugees, but representing highly conscious refugee community with a political leadership structure and armed section engaged in warfare with a political objective. Given this backdrop, there have been two narratives. On one hand, those refugees are simply the victims of Turkey's brutal policies. On the other hand, they were an integral part of the PKK, and given that they were political agents. Therefore, in my research, I traced the political identity of the Kurdish refugees basically by problematizing victim, agent, passive, active, or voiceless vocal classifications, often referred in migration studies. And I also problematized the conventional approach to refugee warriors communities whose political identity is often defined in relation with the armed groups they are affiliated with. And given my research findings, first, I argue that the political identity of the Kurdish refugees is not given, but developed and transformed in a way to transcend those classifications. And rather than the root causes of the migration, the long-lasting refugee experience is the determinant factor in political identity construction process of the Kurdish refugees. Second, I argue that the Kurdish refugees' self-understanding and their perceptions of Kurdistan transform over time and contexts, which constitute basis for the Kurdish refugees to become the agents of their own political act, whereas such a political agent position puts them at odds with the PKK in certain occasions. So briefly, the summary of my findings are as follows. The transformation of the political identity of the Kurdish refugees indicate that over time and contexts, first, the reference to their party affiliation, PKK, has been replaced with the reference to their ethnic belonging, Kurdishness. Second, the reference to their country of origin, Turkey, has been replaced with reference to homeland, Kurdistan. And third, in terms of political objectives, struggle for achieving political goals in home country, Turkey, has been replaced with the struggle for defense and reconstruction of Kurdistan as a whole. I would also like to note that most of the Kurdish refugees have constantly refused to name themselves as refugees, even though they preserve their legal refugee status. In their point of view, the refugee status is just a symbol of occupation of their hometowns, but not an identification of their actual presence in Iraqi Kurdistan. In this regard, taking refuge in Kurdistan perceived as a practice of re-engagement with ancestral homeland. Simply put, they prefer to define themselves as Kurds in Kurdistan. And finally, the repatriation, which is seemingly conditional with the realization of the political objectives of the PKK, doesn't refer to an actual exit from the host country. So actually, I would like to also, I have already outlined those changing contexts which explains such a transformation, but in all cases, it will take more than 2 minutes. That's why I will stop here and leave the floor to Zeynep.
Thank you, Arzu. Brilliant timing and very clear as well. Thank you so much. Okay, so over to our last but not least speaker, Ohannes. I'm gonna mute myself and leave the floor to you. Thank you.
Okay, let me start by thanking LSE Middle East Center for organizing this event, and of course my old friend Güneş Murat Tezcür for editing this book and give me the chance to take part in it. It's an honor for me. So the concern of my article in the book is to understand the intercommunal relations between Kurds and Armenians just before the Armenian genocide. More specifically speaking, my context or the context of the article is the second constitutional period of the Ottoman Empire. As you know, started in July 1908, when the parliament and constitution were restored after 33 years of despotic regime by Abdülhamid II. And after these 33 years of despotic regime, all peoples of the empire, especially Christians, were hopeful for a more free and democratic country. And the Hamidian regime had established a heavy censorship on press. Once this censorship lifted after the revolution, the number of newspapers and periodicals in different languages of empire skyrocketed. And as a matter of fact, my main source in my article is the Armenian newspapers and periodicals of this time after 1908. So in this, let's say, optimistic environment, Armenians were also hopeful to solve their problems with Kurds in eastern provinces of the empire. I mean, although every single Armenian was not in conflict with every single Kurd, there were, let's say, perennial and insistent problems between these two communities, especially in eastern provinces. Here I will mention only two of them, namely land extortions and security problems. For the land issues, let's say maybe it's the most important source of mutual enmity, namely the lands grabbed from Armenians by various actors, one of which was Kurdish ones. For example, the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople published a series of reports between 1910 and 12, where they collected the cases of land seizures in different provinces. And the number of cases mentioned in these reports were 982, and 870 of these 982, which equals almost 90% of cases, were in these 6 provinces, eastern provinces, where Armenians and Kurds were living side by side. Some of these disputes, I mean land disputes, had persisted for decades, since 1890s or even 1880s. It is unsurprising that this longevity of the disputes contributed to the accumulation of intercommunal tension between Kurds and Armenians, as younger generations took over this problem from their fathers, even their grandfathers. As one may guess, bloodshed was not uncommon because of this conflict. In addition to land seizures, assaults threatening the security of life, movable property, and honor of Armenians were another factor that deteriorated the intercommunal relations between Kurds and Armenians. Kurdish chieftains and groups were not the only ones attacking the Armenians, of course, but these attacks in eastern provinces were a routine part of daily life. The contemporary Armenian press frequently reported such attacks taking place in various locations. In some, these perennial problems of land disputes and public security and absence of rule of law continued to be the biggest impediments for peaceful cohabitation of communities. The promulgation of constitution, let's say unfortunately, did not solve this kind of problems in the provinces. The longer these problems remained unsolved, the more Armenians lost their trust in the new constitutional regime. So in this environment, one of the frequent questions handled in contemporary Armenian press was, quote unquote, what shall we do with Kurds? In most of these articles, Armenian authors depicted Kurds, quote unquote, as semi-savage, barbaric, or at best uneducated people. According to these commentators, Kurds were still living in a feudal order, which did harm not only themselves, but also Armenians. According to this approach or this thinking, as long as Kurds remained in ignorance and feudalism, Armenians would continue to suffer from them. Therefore, Armenian commentators suggested helping Kurds in coming out of quote-unquote dark ages. One of them says, for example, quote, "Give them light, education. Within a decade or two, they, as a brisk and strong race, will be able to contribute to our fatherland," unquote. According to many commentators, Armenians should have taken the responsibility of quote-unquote enlightening Kurds. For example, Armenians could assist them in overcoming illiteracy, which was a major problem among Kurds. Even one of them suggested to prepare primers to teach Kurds reading and writing in Kurdish, but this is interesting, in Armenian scripts. Even they attempted to do this. Shortly, one may say that the Armenian provincial intellectuals especially ascribed a mission of civilization to themselves vis-a-vis Kurds. I'm sure this reminds many of you the Western approach to peoples in their colonies. Just like Europeans had ascribed a civilizing mission to themselves by the phrase of white man burdens, Armenians did so for them, similar thing for themselves, as I say, vis-a-vis Kurd. And just like Europeans had defined native people of the colonies as quote-unquote noble savages, Armenians defined Kurds in a similar way in these sources. However, there were two crucial differences between Armenians and, of course, Westerner colonizers. First, Armenians were not aliens or invaders or outsiders in Anatolia. Second, they did not have political and military domination, of course, in Anatolia, like Westerners did in their colonies. So Armenians' civilizing discourse was not an attempt, unlike Westerners, to legitimize their political domination, since they did not have such a domination. Rather, it was an attempt to compromise with the stronger party, that is, Kurds, Turks and Muslims in that sense. So as the politically weaker party, they ascribed moral superiority to themselves to save their honor, okay, under this attack. So if you like, they put themselves in white man's shoes, but indeed they were, quote unquote, the Indians in the scene, which they would learn soon in 1915 and following years. Let me stop here. It was a quick summary of my article. For details, maybe we can go into the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ohannes. Okay, that was great. We covered so much ground actually in such a short time, and I know I've read your chapters. They are much richer and more. There's lots of analysis and insights in them. So it's a shame we can't talk about all that. But let's move on to questions. Any questions from the audience to the speakers? If not, I have a couple of questions. I'm going to use my privilege as the chair to ask some questions while the listeners might be thinking of their own questions. So my first question is to, I'll start with Majid actually. I'm interested in the Yezidis in the Soviet Union and today's Russia. Like, when did they go there and why did they go? What's the number of, what's their size? How many people are we talking about living in Russia that belong to the Yazidi community?
According to sources, of course, the origin region for Yazidis, it's so-called Kurdistan, or in Turkey and Iraq, Syria. Some of them was in Iran. In the middle of 19th century, they started after some when the genocide started against other non-Muslims like Armenian, Assyrian, and Yazidi. Also, they immigrated to Armenia and Georgia, and then to other countries which they belong to Soviet Union. And especially after, if we, of course, my topic was about identity. There, a lot of people participate against, and not just Ottoman, not just Turkish. Of course, the follower who, like it's called Hamidiyya followers, most of them was Kurdish. They also participate, and the genocide and mass killing against Yezidi and other Armenian and others. And they immigrated to other countries and they started their new life there. This was your question, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
So we have a question from Rosie Leroy. She's thanking for the presentations, and a question for Majid again. Based on your research, how do you think growing up with the 2014 genocide has affected the identity and outlook of Yazidi children, both boys and girls?
Of course, I think the identity of Yazidi is of course in the process of transmission, and especially after the genocide of Firman of 2014, the mentality of people changed. Their identity is going to be, as I use it in my chapter also, we call it, they call them that ethno-religious minority group. The impact of children also, it has huge impact on the children. Still more than 300,000 and 50,000 still in camps, and they cannot be educated well, and they are around the big cities, which there is some kind of discrimination also. They think that they are different from other Muslims or Kurdish. So I believe this case will continue, and it will have, of course, huge impact on their psychology and how they, of course, we cannot talk about future, but of course this kind of identity will have some kind of transformation and will continue in the future.
Thank you, Majid. That was great. I will move on to a question. Actually, I have a question for Güneş as well. I'm going to combine it with Bob's question, and then I'll go back to Arzu. There's a question for Arzu there as well. This is more about the study of the Yazidis, has been marginalized in Western academia, and Bob wants to know what's the state of research on the Yazidis within the region. Do you have any knowledge of that? And I'm also adding to that question, the interest in the Yazidis, as you said, has increased, especially after 2014. And do you think this research is going to continue, or now that the issue has kind of seems to be dropping from the international agenda? Will that interest continue in the research, in the academic field? That's it, basically. That's the question.
Thank you, Bob and Zeynep, for this question. So I actually look at the number of dissertations written about the Yazidis from 1980 to 2018. I mean, in English sources, so there's obviously some scholars who are using some other Western languages like French or German, but which is interesting because you only have like 9 dissertations from 1980 up until 2018 on the Yazidis. And there's not a single dissertation written about the Yazidis from, if I can check this number correctly, from 1996 up until 2016. So for 20 years, from 1996 until 2016, nobody wrote a single doctoral dissertation about the Yazidis in English-speaking academia. So it's not always changing. I have a student who is Tutku, who also made a contribution to this dissertation. She's writing a dissertation about post-genocide gender relations among Yezidis. So when it comes to region, it's just more complicated, and maybe Majid can also reflect on that, because I think we don't really have the infrastructure, the intelligentsia in the region who can study the Yezidis in a setting of academic freedom. But then at the same time, I think since there has been an increase in the Yezidi diaspora in Germany, but also in North America, in Canada, in the United States, we will definitely see more people, and I think coming from the Yezidi community itself, who are going to basically just do some work on the these topics. I mean, I think kind of similar to how it happened with the Kurdish studies, because for a long time, Kurdish studies were dominated by people who are non-Kurds. And I'm not saying in a more critical manner, but just as a kind of a factual observation. But in the maybe last 20 years, or specifically in the last decade, you basically see many young Kurdish scholars who made some very important contributions to Kurdish studies. So in a sense, I think we can see some kind of similar trend within the Yezidi studies, but with the caveat that obviously Yezidis are a much smaller community. So there will be obviously this kind of asymmetry. And do you want me to say maybe something about the Yezidi? Because there's one more question I can say, address the Jim Muir's question about the impacts of the 2014. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Sure. I will come to that actually. I will come back. We will go to Arzu and then we'll revolve back to Yezidi again. Okay, thank you, Güneş. That was great. Arzu, there's a question for you by Clara McLinden. She's thanking for the interesting discussion, and she's asking a question regarding the shift in perception of self from associating with PKK towards a more ethnic notion of self, Kurdish or Kurdistan. Was there a particular moment when this shift can be attributed to?
Actually, it's a process. I can't indicate significantly one very special moment. But maybe it is important to underline that those people who, at the very early stages of the migration, when they took refuge to Iraqi Kurdistan, they prefer to identify themselves as PKK'li, you know. And the process, I mean, in Etrush camp and then afterwards in Mahmur, is a process of PKK'leşmek. It's really hard to put it in English, but becoming, you know, PKK or being a PKK, PKK means pure Kurdishness, pure Kurdish. You can become a pure Kurdish if you follow the procedures or ideology of PKK. This is the basic idea which shapes the self-understanding, or whatever you say, at the very early stages of the migration. However, this is why I actually said I have also outlined those changing contexts in order to help people to understand what this transformation is about, or what makes this transformation possible. And I, in that sense, not one significant moment, but two different levels. The first level is personal level. For 100 years, these people, you know, with an absolute control over the borders, these people couldn't have the opportunity to know each other. And the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan, to some extent, has been the other for the Kurds who took refuge to Iraqi Kurdistan. So face-to-face, first experience, first-hand information about the other, I can say is one of the important dimensions which help them to change their attitudes. Because I don't want to take more time, but there are lots of interviews I can refer, but finally, this face-to-face experience, first-hand information about the other, finally result in a conscience, like, for instance, I remember one of the interviewers said, at the end of the day, I realized that, you know, beyond all these ideological differences, linguistic or cultural, geographical differences, we all paid for Kurdistan. So the price paid for Kurdistan emerges as a common basis, depending on this face-to-face experience. Second is experience with the PKK authority, of course, direct and full authority of the PKK. This also, makes those refugees realize new types of oppression mechanisms. And in local level, there are three, I think, more or less, I can say there are three different, in local level, there are three different processes. One is consensus between the PKK and the KDP, because this paves the way for refugees to give more voice to their own needs, interests, and so forth. And I have to underline that this consensus actually depends on the agreement brokered between the KDP and the PKK in 2002, but it is basically a power sharing agreement. And given that agreement, those parts commit that they would not interfere in each other's area of control. However, Mahmur, for instance, Camp Mahmur becomes an exception. In time, it becomes an exception because of the refugees' attitudes, changing attitudes towards the KDP and the PKK. I will leave it here. And the second is the relative success of the self-governance in Kurdistan region of Iraq vis-a-vis the failure of the free independent Kurdistan project of the PKK. And the third is the paradigm shift took place in PKK ideology, which raised the, which in a way highlighted a motto, a kind of motto, make the change through reform, but not through destruction, because before 2000, destructing all the system and rebuilding and building up a new system was the political goal. So these first in personal level, second in local level, these three contexts, different contexts, I think makes this transformation happen.
Thank you, Arzu. You did well despite the sun, glaring.
Yes.
Providing that context for your analysis, so that was really interesting. Okay, so we have two questions about the Yezidis, three questions actually. One about the identity shifts transformation in relation to their own transformation asked by Cemur, and then another one about the differences between the Kurds, and then after Mosul. I have a question for Ohannes. So I want to go to Armenian Kurdish relations, and then we'll come back to Yezidis and finish it there. We have very limited time, 5-7 minutes. So I will ask everyone to be very brief in their answers, please. So I will ask the two Yezidi questions combined to Yezidi to both of you guys. Ohannes, the question I wanted to ask is about the how the Armenians constructed their version of sort of Orientalism, if that's the right word to use, in vis-a-vis the Kurds. That kind of discourse produced by the Armenian intellectuals you referred to. Who are these Armenian intellectuals? Where did they get educated? Where are they from? What's their background? Based on what kind of background did they produce these ideas?
Yeah, I mean, basically, more specifically speaking, these authors or commentators writing in provincial periodicals were, let's say, journal editors, of course, teachers at colleges, and students, college students, lawyers, some professionals, like lawyers, in some cases even, let's say, physicians, doctors, etc. Of course, as in every other historical studies, they represent a certain class within Armenians. And it's a long story, but to cut it short, most of them got their education, higher education, in colleges opened by missionaries, especially American missionaries in across Anatolia, in different locations, in Harput, Antep, Merzifon, Tarsus, etc. And some of them even got their higher education in high-level universities of United States, like Yale, or I don't know, you can count, and or in some universities of Europe of the time, in Switzerland, in France, etc. So their background was in this profile, let's say, more or less speaking. And of course, as I say, let me finish by repeating that, of course, they represent a certain class. There, maybe it's debatable whether their point of view can be extended to other levels or other strata of Armenian community, but this is the situation with these people.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ohannes. So going back to the Yezidis, Jim Muir's question is, did the horrors inflicted by ISIS in and after 2014 cause a change in Yezidi's sense of identity, perhaps a hardening and toughening effect? Or has their identity become primarily a kind of victimhood? Güneş, you referred to this a little bit, so you could elaborate on that a little bit more. And how has such a traditional society coped with such challenges as the return of the victims, the women who were sexually attacked by the Yezidis? They don't like using this word slave Yezidi, so I'm not using that word either. And a question by Gillian there: have they put aside historical differences, and do Kurds and Yezidis recognize each other's legitimacy now? Do they accept coexistence today and try to support each other against the dominant Iraqi Muslim majorities? So I'm asking these questions combined to Güneş and Majid. Who would like to take them first? As I said, please keep your answers brief. Thank you.
May I start a little bit, Güneş? Okay. Of course, the differences cannot be finished like that, but the 2014 the difference make more deeply between two kind of peoples, Kurdish Sunni and Yezidi. And as I said, and in details also of my researches, that the identity of Yezidi has become one kind of ethno-religious group. It's not like the political parties say. For example, in Saddam time, they say Yezidi are Arabs, and after that, some political parties claim that they are Kurds. What the Yezidi think about? Of course, as it's clear, all Yezidi are not Kurds ethnically, and there is Arabs, and the Yezidi have holy text, which is different languages, which mean in 12th century, when this religion started to be an ethno-religious, different ethnic belong to this faith and religion. I think both Kurdish are not independent state, and Yezidi also are not independent state. To have bad relation or good relation, they are in one country. Of course, there is constitution in country, and they can be fine. And of course, one question also asking if they back to Mosul or not. Mosul is become free now, and people can go and back, but still most of Yezidi are in camps around Dog.
Thank you, Majid, and thanks for referring to Bruce Stanley's question as well. So, Güneş, over to you, please.
Sure. And coming to Jim Muir's question, some of the chapters actually directly address that. My chapter, co-authored with Zeynep and Bayadovsky, and also Tutku Ayhan's chapter, offers some extended discussions about this post-genocidal transformation. But just very briefly, it has been obviously a very complicated and difficult process because it's a very traditional society with lots of patriarchal practices. But I think that is basically evolving now. Yezidi leadership actually accepted the women who were assaulted back in the community. But when it comes to the children who are basically, in a sense, children of rape, if I can use this word, there's obviously much more complicated. There's much more resistance from the society accepting or not accepting these children. But I should also emphasize that, as Majid mentioned, most of the Yezidis in Iraq still live in camps under less than ideal circumstances. Many of them become refugees in Europe or in other Western countries. So there's this kind of fragmentation of the society, in a sense that there's a fragmentation of the authority but also fragmentation from a spatial sense. And I think that is going to have huge influences how the Yezidi identity is going to evolve over time. Because yes, it used to be more insulated, traditional society, but now you basically see lots of young activists became much more vocal, becoming much more visible, especially in the Western countries, and they have the skills to kind of really make a case for them. So I think they will also kind of really going to transform how the notion of authority and the hierarchy is going to be pursued by the Yezidis. So I can emphasize that. And maybe regarding about the Mosul question, I mean, Mosul became like a no-go zone for the Yezidis well before 2014. In 2007, the ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq, actually put an embargo on the Yazidi areas. So in a sense, Yazidis were kind of really cut off from Mosul for a long time. I basically talked to lots of Yazidis, and they basically mentioned how they were subject to lots of attacks well before 2014. So I don't really think that the Mosul is going to be a place where the Yazidis are going to come back. And maybe primarily because, other than the destruction, is because of the poisoned social relations. Because most of the people who attacked the Yazidis were not necessarily foreign fighters, even if they obviously participated in the atrocities, but actually they were local people. I mean, if you think about that, in a sense, bringing these people together in the long run is extremely complicated process and probably not very feasible.
Thank you, Güneş. That was great, short and very informative. So, I will Bruce Stanley's question about Mosul. I think I would consider that answered as well, about their return to the city and like how are they working in relation to rebuilding the city. There is a final question about Russia by Lema Shehadi. What role does Russia play among Yezidi or Kurdish communities today, given the historic connections to the Soviet Union that were mentioned? Güneş, do you want to take this question first? If you're
I will leave it to Majid because I think Majid is well positioned to answer it.
Majid, you're muted.
Can you repeat the question again, please?
This is a question about Russia, referring to the earlier discussion that they play, they have played historically an important role among Yazidis and Kurdish communities today. So, given those historical connections, what role does Russia play today?
I think they don't have a huge role, especially in Iraq. Maybe they have some kind of role inside Rojava and Syria. But in Iraq, it's like Soviet Union policy toward Kurds and Yezidis also. Even the Yezidis in Georgia, in Armenia, in Russia, in Ukraine, they belong to their countries, and they have such. I think that constitution deal with different people there. So their policy, the same policy like Soviet Union. With Kurds, with other minorities, even with Iraqi government. But it's clear in media which kind of policy they have inside Syria and with Kurdish and their relation with Turkey and with USA.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry for rushing you guys in the last 10 minutes, but we are already over time, 10 minutes over time. So thank you, Nadine, for being flexible. So I will, to me, now that, this is a good time to finish now that there are no questions anymore. I just would like to thank you so much, all of you, Güneş, Arzu, Majid, and Ohannes, for giving your time, coming here and talking. It's been a really great journey working on this book together. Our conversations in Florida, our conversations in Kurdistan with Güneş, and the project that we worked on. So it's been a great pleasure and honor to have been part of this journey. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you very much also to all the questions that were asked during the talk. So hope to meet you again. And thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.